Okay, let's dive into a really intense chapter of recent history. We're looking at the dramatic events in Syria, December 2024.
Yeah, the fall of Damascus, the rise of, well, forces linked to HTS.
Right. And this wasn't, sudden. It's part of this incredibly long, costly conflict.
And it connects deeply, doesn't it, to this whole history of external powers trying to shape the region?
Yeah.
Goes
And
way back.
all the way back to maps drawn, what, a century
Oh,
ago?
exactly. There's a perspective that sees this recent turn as like the culmination of a really persistent effort by outside forces to fundamentally alter Syria and the wider Middle East.
So this view connects the current situation right back to those historical colonial agreements and ongoing strategies.
Directly. It's central to this particular narrative.
Okay. So for this deep dive, our goal is to really understand the historical context and the very specific claims being made about the different groups, the individuals, the international players allegedly involved.
Leading up to and including those, dramatic recent changes.
Yeah. We're exploring how this one narrative connects the dots, essentially, from something like Sykes-Picot right up to the geopolitics we're seeing play out now.
And if you trace this narrative, it often starts right there.
Yeah.
With Sykes-Picot in 1916. That secret deal after the Ottoman Empire collapsed.
The one that carved up the region into British and French spheres of influence.
Right. And a core argument here is that the borders they drew, well, they paid little, maybe no attention to the actual people living there.
Yeah.
The ethnic, tribal, religious lines.
And the suggestion is that this disregard basically engineered instability, conflict for decades.
For a century, yeah. And Syria, specifically in this narrative, is positioned as a country that actively resisted these divisions.
Like it withstood decades of clandestine operations because it challenged those lines. It blurred them.
Precisely. It didn't fit neatly into the colonial map. And the argument goes further, suggesting that the rise of what gets termed resistance movements across Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen has actively worked to unravel those colonial borders, kind of fostering a shared identity, linking these different fronts.
And there's a pretty striking claim tied to that, isn't there?
There is, that Western powers, sort of foreseeing this resistance, might reject the fragmented map, then launch the Arab Springs.
But not as organic uprisings?
Not in this view. It's framed as a strategic move, designed to reconfigure roles beyond Sykes-Picot, a kind of preemptive reshaping.
Wow. And the scale of the conflict, seen through this lens, it's presented as just immense, tragic.
The narrative suggests the process leading to the fall of Syria took like 14 long, bloody years.
14 years. And the human cost.
Claimed to be around 1 million Syrians perished. And a significant number, it said, were soldiers in the Syrian Arab army.
Fighting what this perspective calls terrorist proxy forces.
That's the term used, yes.
Right.
Fighting to defend the country from these forces, allegedly unleashed by the U.S., U.K., EU, Turkey, Arab Gulf states, and Israel.
That's a very specific list.
It is. And it's described as part of a Takfiri project, that ideology of declaring other Muslims apostates to justify violence.
Right.
And the claim is this project was hatched by the UK and US post 9/11 in defense of Israel. That's a really specific and very contentious claim about the conflict's origins and motives.
Okay, let's unpack how this narrative traces those origins even further back. It suggests the whole regime change war against Syria goes back to specific people. Blair and Bush are named.
Yeah, Tony Blair, George W. Bush.
Yeah.
And this connects to a document presented as like a key strategic blueprint.
The clean break doctrine.
That's the one. Described as a 1996 strategy paper, apparently for Israel, outlining how Israel could shape its strategic environment, working with Turkey and Jordan.
By doing what, exactly?
By actively weakening, containing, and even rolling back Syria. That's the language used in describing it.
And there was a specific objective highlighted within that, wasn't there? About Iraq.
Yes. Removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, presented not just as, an end goal for Iraq, but as a specific means to foil Syria's regional ambitions.
So dealing with Iraq was seen as a way to get at Syria.
That's the interpretation. There's a quote attributed to Pat Buchanan, the U.S. political commentator.
Oh, yeah.
He's quoted in this narrative saying, "In the Pearl Faith Wormser strategy, Israel's enemy remains Syria, but the road to Damascus runs through Baghdad." Pretty direct linkage there.
Wow. Okay. So fast forward to post 9/11. This narrative brings in analysis linked to the Chilcot report on the Iraq War.
Right. Suggesting highly significant evidence of a broader and covert geostrategic policy.
Broader than just Iraq.
claimed to include planned action against both Syria and Iran, and reportedly backed up by a close-knit propaganda campaign.
And communications between Bush and Blair right after 9/11 are mentioned too.
Referenced as pointing towards the destabilization of Syria as the last resort, like a plan B.
Only if other efforts failed.
According to this analysis, yeah. Only if attempts to bring Syria on board with the Western alliance, and crucially, separated from the resistance axis, Iran, Hezbollah, etc., didn't work.
So, this deep history, these alleged strategies, communications, it all builds towards December 2024.
Exactly. The final fall of the Syrian capital, Damascus, described as happening after a rapid advance by what this narrative calls forces of terror.
And the assertion is made that these forces were controlled.
Operating under the control of Turkey and Israel, is the claim, with the hidden hands of the UK and US controlling events behind the scenes. Very direct claims of external manipulation.
And the claim about who rules now is stark.
Yeah, al-Qaeda now rules in Syria, leading, it's asserted, ethnic cleansing pogroms against all minorities and Sunni Muslim communities who reject the Dark Age policies of the Takfiri settler alliance.
A complete reversal of what Syria was in this view.
The perspective presented is that the secular, inclusive Syria that resisted neocolonialism is now, temporarily at least, subjected to the ravages of empire.
And empire here means?
The list given includes Turkey, Russia, Israel, the US, the UK, and the Arab Gulf states, often framed as interconnected, especially the US, UK, Israel, and Gulf states in this context.
What's really interesting is the claim that after that December 2024 shift, with Sykes-Picot seen as, irredeemably lost, both France and global Britain are allegedly scrambling, trying to restore colonial order.
Yeah, this narrative points to specific claims about French actions. Mention of a French military presence. Local forces apparently suggesting French troops as a buffer.
And business deals are brought in as potential evidence.
Right. What's called the al-Qaeda General Authority for Land and Seaports in Syria reportedly signed an MOU with the French company CMA-CGM.
For what?
To set up and run dry ports. And CMA-CGM also apparently renewed its contract for the port of Latakia for 30 years.
It just ties into another idea presented about France's historical interests.
Exactly. The narrative suggests France, with its old mandate ties to the coastal region, might see a chance to restore an independent Alawite state under French control.
And the actions attributed to the current leader, Jolani, including claims of ethnic cleansing,
are presented as potentially serving that French purpose in this particular interpretation.
But the narrative really zooms in on the claimed British role, doesn't it? Suggesting Britain took a far more direct line after December 2024.
It does. And this brings us to claims involving Robert Ford, the former U.S. ambassador to Syria.
Okay, what about him?
In a talk reportedly given May 2025, he allegedly said that back in 2023, he was invited by a British non-governmental organization which specializes in conflict resolution.
An NGO. To do what?
To help them bring Jolani out of the terrorist world and into regular politics. That's the quote attributed to Ford.
Wow. So Ford allegedly worked with this British NGO.
He reportedly made 2 trips in 2023 with them, and then another trip in January 2024, right after the change in Damascus, meeting Jolani in the capital with the NGO.
And do we know which NGO this allegedly was?
Reports cited from informed sources in independent Arabia apparently identified it as the London-based Intermediate.
And its founder,
Jonathan Powell, former chief of staff to Tony Blair.
Ah, the Blair connection again.
And this narrative explicitly labels Powell an architect of the regime change war against Syria alongside George W. Bush, citing his role in the Iraq war lead-up.
Tied to Blair's liberal interventionism idea.
That's the connection made. And a significant point highlighted is Powell's move in November 2024, just before Damascus fell, to become Keir Starmer's national security advisor.
Leaving IM right before the shift.
Apparently, yes. And given reports about Blair's influence on Starmer, this is suggested as potentially aligning with Blair's alleged long-term Syria plan.
What about IM's connections? Anything more there?
Martin Griffiths is mentioned as a co-founder. But more pointedly, it's reported IM benefits from an alleged tight-knit connection with the MI6 and the Foreign Office.
MI6? Really?
That's the claim. And apparently, it received significant funding from the UK Foreign Office between 2011 and 2020, about £4 million mentioned.
Is there any, hard evidence claimed for this MI6 link?
The narrative asserts there is. Showing Powell allegedly told Hillary Clinton's aide, Jake Sullivan, back in 2012 about IM's MI6 links.
He told Sullivan?
Powell reportedly stated IM works closely with FCO, NSC, and SIS MI6 in London. and organizes secret channels between insurgents and governments, mentioning they'd just started work in Syria.
And this was around the time Sullivan reportedly emailed Clinton saying,
Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. That context is heavily emphasized.
So the claim is this NGO IM is essentially staffed with intelligence and military figures?
Allegedly stocked with former MI6 operatives and military special forces. That's the assertion.
Leading to an interpretation of Powell's role as what? A continuous thread.
Extending from the Blair War era right into the present under Starmer, with the purpose, allegedly, to normalize the al-Qaeda junta in public perception, push British policies, and secure UK influence.
And October 7th gets woven into this.
Yes. Analyst Miriam Cherabadi has cited, suggesting that with Israeli deterrence shattered and Damascus driven into al-Jolani's hands, Britain saw a chance to reclaim influence.
Implying that weakening resistance movements helps the UK.
That's the idea presented. A chance to entrench influence long-term, maybe even expand into Iraq or Egypt.
Okay, are there other pieces of evidence presented for this external involvement narrative?
There are. A report in the National, Feb 2025, about Powell meeting the new administration, led by Jolani, described again as a former ISIS and al-Qaeda agent.
And this report detailed UK influence how?
Allegedly through political connections, so-called charity operations, and a returning diaspora network.
There's also a connection drawn to the said foundation.
Yeah, Lord Charles Powell, Jonathan's brother, is a trustee. Foundation set up by Wafik Said.
And Wafik Said reportedly met Jolani in Damascus.
January 2025, according to the claims. And the narrative suggests Jonathan Powell gained deep knowledge of Syria via the Said Foundation's alleged intelligence gathering.
It's also claimed Powell had contacts with HTS before they came to power.
Asserted that he had established back-channel contacts, managed through IM, meeting Jolani as far back as 2021. Yeah, linked to that PBS Frontline documentary, The Jihadist, described here as an early rebranding attempt.
Another name that comes up is Hamish de Bretton-Gordon.
Described in this narrative as a suspected MI6 operative, reportedly in Damascus, right after the shift.
Doing what?
Visiting the new health ministry, promoting the white helmets who are described here as MI6 incubated.
And this is presented alongside serious accusations against the white helmets themselves.
Yes, the narrative highlights accusations like organ trafficking, child abduction, staging chemical attacks, theft, murder, all unaddressed, it says.
Yet de Bretton-Gordon is quoted supporting UK engagement,
saying Britain is uniquely placed to make a real difference, and opening the British embassy in Damascus cannot happen soon enough, seen as fitting the re-engagement narrative.
French journalist Georges Malbrunot is mentioned too.
His article reportedly discussed IM's involvement in the Jolani grooming campaign, focusing on reformed al-Qaeda figures like the caretaker foreign minister, Assad Hassan al-Shabaani.
Described as a founder of al-Qaeda in Syria.
That's the specific description used. And an IM employee, Lucy Stewart, is claimed to be advising Shabaani.
Leading to speculation about Blair.
Raising the question, did Stewart arrange the Tony Blair interview with Shabaani at Davos 2025? Blair reportedly seemed to gloss over alleged atrocities.
Leading to the question, is Blair marking his territory, the Machiavellian orchestrator?
That's the provocative question posed within this narrative.
Okay, broadening out again, geopolitical implications. Jordan comes up.
Yes. Miriam Cherabadi's comment again, suggesting the new setup in Syria could bolster Jordan, maybe allowing Britain to shift its Arab command post there.
Reinforced by Powell's visit to Jordan.
His alleged May 2025 visit, meeting King Abdullah, discussing deep-rooted ties, defense cooperation. But the narrative counters this, asserting Britain actually causes instability via Orientalism and its legacy, including the birth of the Zionist project.
And Jordan has its own concerns.
Reported fears over Palestinian displacement, possibly linked to UK efforts, in this view, to prevent refugees entering Jordan.
What about Jolani denying meeting Ford in 2023?
That's noted. The interpretation offered is Jolani might be trying to conceal the obvious MI6 involvement in his alleged rebranding and rise.
So the narrative insists the backing is clear.
It asserts the hands behind Jolani are now exposed and claims Britain has led the intelligence operations against Syria since the beginning. Very definitive statements.
There's even a claim about British military capture.
Yeah, alleging a British private military contractor, Emerald Solutions, is supporting Jolani's regime post-fall, normalizing relations presented as part of the Blair-Bush project.
And Britain welcoming transitional justice commissions. How is that viewed?
Critically, the narrative argues relying on HTS to investigate their own alleged crimes is meaningless. like asking Israel to investigate Gaza, it says.
And claiming militia crimes increased after British involvement.
That assertion is made, yes.
Then there's the visit by the British military attaché, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith, to Damascus in May 2025.
Highlighted as evidence, Britain is looking to secure defense and military cooperation with al-Qaeda, HTS.
For what reasons, according to this narrative?
It's presented as multi-layered. Favoring Israel, controlling the Takfiri threat to Israel, re-embedding Britain, redrawing Sykes-Picot lines for Greater Israel, and the U.S. Gulf Alliance, isolating Iran.
And countering Russia.
Yes, potentially preventing Russian consolidation near the coast, where Levantine gas reserves lie.
There's even a suggestion linking this visit to attacks on a Russian base.
It's suggested as perhaps no coincidence that Turkish-backed attacks on the Russian Hainan base happened shortly after Smith's visit. Britain's historical animosity towards Russia is cited as a key factor.
And Marco Rubio's comment about potential civil war fits in how?
It raises the question, within this narrative, of whether Britain is positioning itself to basically run a new client state in Syria.
Okay, so summing up this narrative's conclusion, Britain bears huge responsibility.
That's the assertion. Huge responsibility for every life lost in Syria since 2011 and in the preceding years of alleged interference.
And Rubio's comment about instability? The interpretation is?
Stability is needed, but for Israel's security, which means Syria must become a Western client state, normalize with Israel, and not be a resistance axis hub.
There's a quote from Marwa Osman about the U.S. sanctions suspension,
describing it as asset recovery and blackmail for normalization, presenting Syria's choice as resistance or rent a state.
And Jolani's own words from 2015 are used.
About severing Iran's hands and taking war to Iran. Presented as evidence he's a CIA MI6 managed asset whose agenda is his handlers.
So the final take is, the original regime change plan is succeeding.
The perspective is that the Blair-Bush regime change is on track, and Syria is being torn apart by the predator powers who allegedly targeted it since the creation of the Zionist settler state to prevent pan-Arab unity.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
A really complex narrative connecting so many threads.
It really is. We've walked through this specific viewpoint, tracing alleged external involvement right from Sykes-Picot through doctrines like clean break, the long conflict, the fall of Damascus.
And these very specific claims about individuals, NGOs, like intermediate intelligence links, particularly focusing on the alleged UK role in shaping this new Syria.
Yeah, and the narrative concludes with some pretty powerful, almost prophetic statements, doesn't it?
It does. Talk of a tipping point. An idea of the entire global world order fighting against a group of organized people resisting slavery.
And referencing historian Ilan Pape, describing a long night, suggesting the intensity of current actions by the Zionist alliance, as it's termed, comes from a sense that an end is near for their project, that it's being dismantled.
Dismantled from within and from outside by discrete processes.
Right. And that final, really provocative thought presented from Palestinian author Heb Jamal.
Zionism will collapse and Sykes-Picot will collapse. And the call to action, we don't get to opt out.
Because the cost of our silence is paid in lives. And we have to stand on the right side of history.
It definitely leaves you thinking about the weight of these claims, the history, and what it all might mean for the future of the region.
Absolutely. A future still being contested, shaped by these deep historical currents, conflicts, and competing visions.